This is my take from podcast. If you want to listen summary of podcast, start with a free trial for detailed summaries on Apple Podcasts and Spotify using link in descriptions. Here is key point discussed in podcast The Modern Sex Work Debate, Bonnie Blue, Louise Perry, 4KK. You know, what's really interesting about Bonnie Blue is that she's not traumatized by her work in the sex industry. In fact, she's very open about the fact that she enjoys it and that it's made her happy. She's not distressed or upset by it, and she's not doing it because she's been coerced or manipulated into it. She's doing it because she wants to, and that's a really important distinction to make. What's also really interesting is that Bonnie doesn't seem to have the same emotional or physical reactions to sex that a lot of other women do. She doesn't get repulsed by the idea of having sex with multiple men, and she doesn't seem to have a high threshold for disgust. She's very matter-of-fact about it, and she sees it as just something that she does. She knows what she's comfortable with and what she's not, and she's not afraid to speak up and say no if she's not comfortable with something. That's a really important thing for anyone to have, regardless of what they're doing. It's also interesting to hear Bonnie talk about how she got into the sex industry. She shifted doing it because she wanted to make money and have more freedom in her life. She didn't want to go back to working in recruitment, which she found to be long hours and restrictive. She wanted to be able to travel and have more time with her family, and she saw the sex industry as a way to do that. What's also really interesting is that Bonnie doesn't seem to have the same need for validation or approval from others that a lot of women do. She's not bothered by the fact that some women might hate her or be jealous of her. She's very confident in herself and what she's doing, and she's not afraid to speak her mind and be honest about what she thinks. She knows that she's unusual in her views and her behavior, and she's okay with that. She's not trying to fit in or conform to societal norms. She's just being herself and doing what makes her happy. It's also interesting to hear Bonnie talk about how she sees sex. She sees it as just something that she does, something that's fun and enjoyable. She doesn't see it as something that's sacred or relational. She just sees it as something that she enjoys, and that's it. She knows that she's going to stop at some point, and she's okay with that. She's not worried about what other people might think or say. She's just focused on what makes her happy and what she wants to do. It's also interesting to hear Bonnie talk about how she deals with criticism and negativity. She's very thick-skinned and she's not bothered by what other people might say. She's just focused on what she's doing and what makes her happy. She's not someone who's been coerced or manipulated into doing something that she doesn't want to do. She's someone who's making a choice and who's happy with that choice. And that's a really important thing to remember. You know, it's interesting, Bonnie Blue's perspective on her work and the impact it has on others is really thought-provoking. She believes that she's not the one causing harm in relationships, but rather, she's just a symptom of a larger issue, a lack of communication and connection between partners. She thinks that if someone is cheating, there's usually a reason behind it, and it's not just because they're a bad person. It's often because they're not getting what they need from their partner, and they're looking elsewhere to fulfill that need. What's also fascinating is how Bonnie views her work as a form of empowerment, not just for herself, but for the men who participate in her events. She believes that she's providing a safe space for them to explore their desires, and that she's not forcing anyone to do anything they don't want to do. She's just offering a service, and it's up to the individual to decide whether or not they want to participate. Of course, not everyone agrees with Bonnie's perspective, and some people see her work as damaging to society. They believe that she's contributing to a culture that objectifies women and promotes unhealthy attitudes towards sex. But Bonnie argues that she's just a reflection of the culture we live in, and that she's not the one creating these attitudes, she's just responding to them. It's also worth noting that Bonnie's work has been linked to some negative consequences, such as the objectification of women and the promotion of unhealthy attitudes towards sex. However, she argues that these consequences are not necessarily a direct result of her work, but rather a symptom of a larger societal issue. Ultimately, Bonnie's perspective on her work is complex and multifaceted. While some people may see her as a symbol of empowerment and freedom, others may view her as a contributor to a culture that objectifies and exploits women. But one thing is certain, her work is sparking important conversations about sex, relationships, and the human condition. You know, it's interesting to think about how the normalization of certain behaviors, like rough sex and choking, can have a ripple effect on our culture. When we see it in porn, it can start to seem more acceptable, and that can lead to some really destructive consequences. And it's not just about the physical harm that can come from it, it's also about the way it can shape our attitudes towards sex and relationships. When we see porn that's all about performance and not about communication or consent, it can start to feel like that's what sex is supposed to be like. And that can be really damaging, especially for young people who are just starting to figure out what sex is all about. And we need to be thinking about how we can create a more balanced and healthy approach to sex and relationships. She's talking about the importance of communication and consent in sex, and she's showing people that it's possible to have a healthy and fulfilling sex life without resorting to the kind of extreme or violent behavior that we see in some porn. And it's not just about the people who are involved in it, it's also about the way it can shape our attitudes towards money and power. And we need to be thinking about how we can create a more balanced and healthy approach to sex and relationships. You know, it's interesting. Louise talks about how she would have probably done sex work even if she wasn't famous, just because it offers flexibility. She mentions that she could have done cam work and no one would have known, and that's a big part of the appeal. But what's really striking is how she's able to separate her personal life from her work life. She's very intentional about keeping her home life private, and that's something that she values deeply. And then there's the whole thing with her being famous and having to deal with the constant attention. She talks about how she can't even go out in public without being swarmed by people asking for photos, and how that's not because she's scared of hate, but because she just needs to be able to get somewhere without being mobbed. It's a really interesting perspective on what it's like to be in the public eye. But what's also really interesting is how she talks about her ability to withstand criticism. And then there's the whole thing with her family and how they react to her work. She talks about how she took them to a screening of a documentary that showed some of her more explicit work, and how she was worried about how they would react. But what's really interesting is how she says that she wants to be transparent with her family, and that she wants them to be proud of her. It's a really beautiful thing to see. But what's also really interesting is how she talks about her daughter potentially following in her footsteps. She says that she would explain to her daughter that most people are not like her, and that they would be hurt by the work that she does. But she also says that she wouldn't disown her daughter if she did decide to do sex work, and that she would support her no matter what. It's a really nuanced and thoughtful perspective on a really complex issue. And then there's the whole thing with her son potentially losing his virginity to a sex worker. It's a really interesting perspective on a really taboo topic. But what's also really interesting is how she talks about her children potentially becoming religious and deciding to wait until marriage to lose their virginity. She says that she would be fine with that, and that she thinks it's lovely when people are really religious. And finally, there's the whole thing with her not wanting to lie about being pregnant. She says that she would never do that because it's a sacred thing, and that she values honesty above all else. I'm in control of my life and my decisions, and that scares people. They want to think that I'm a victim because it's easier to understand, but the truth is, I'm not. But at the same time, I'm also very relatable. I'm just a normal person who happens to have a very unusual job. I'm not some kind of monster or freak. I'm just a person who has made certain choices and is living my life in a way that makes me happy. And if people can't accept that, then that's their problem, not mine. They need to stop assuming that I'm a victim or that I'm somehow broken or damaged. They need to stop assuming that I'm only doing this for the money or for attention. Because the truth is, I'm doing this because it makes me happy. And that's all that matters. It's not just about me. It's about all the people out there who are living their lives in a way that doesn't fit into societal norms. It's about all the people who are being judged and criticized for their choices, and who are being told that they're not good enough, or that they're not worthy of love and respect. It's about being true to yourself and living your life in a way that makes you happy. And if people can't accept that, then that's their problem, not mine. She's not trying to justify or explain away her choices, she's just owning them and being honest about who she is and what she does. She's got a unique perspective and approach to life, and she's not trying to fit into some kind of mold or expectation. She's just being herself, and that's really inspiring. She's not trying to encourage people to do something that might not be healthy or sustainable for them. She's just being honest about her own experiences and choices. Life is messy and complicated, and people are complex and multifaceted. She's not trying to convince anyone of her point of view, she's just sharing her own experiences and insights. She's not trying to prove anything to anyone, she's just being herself and owning her choices. She's just unapologetically herself, and that's really inspiring.